You're listening to an Ono Media podcast. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. The new year always feels like a blank slate and a chance to begin anew. And in 2025, maybe you're ready for a plot twist, or maybe there's a part of your story you've been wanting to revise. Life isn't about resolutions that fade by February. It's about picking up the pen and becoming the author of your own life.
Peyton and I are both huge advocates of therapy. We both do therapy. So if you're curious about therapy at all, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy affordable and convenient, serving over 5 million people worldwide. Access a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties.
And easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Write your story with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/husband today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/husband. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This is Murder with My Husband. I'm Peyton Moreland.
And I'm Garrett Moreland.
And he's the husband.
And I'm the husband.
If you are watching on YouTube and you were like, geez, you guys look like death.
We do. Not me. I mean, I meant to say not Peyton. Peyton looks beautiful. I look like crap. I meant to say not you. See, I'm not doing okay. I'm not feeling the best right now. I'm going to be honest. I'm feeling a little loopy. Loopy's not the right word. My head hurts. I don't know, guys. It's the day after Christmas. We're sitting here recording because we love all you guys. And we're also about ready to leave Daisy for a few days. So we're pretty sad about that.
I'll update you on the sitch for Garrett's 10 seconds. So here's what's going on. My knee has been hurting for a while, okay? And then the last couple days I've been noticing that it's just been hurting a little bit more than usual. And then 2 nights ago, it was hurting really bad at night to the point where my foot started to go numb, which of course made me panic a little. And then the next day I woke up, I could barely walk on it. And by last night, it was so swollen, but I didn't do anything to it. So I had no idea what was going on, okay? So I wake up at 3. Well, Daisy wakes Garrett up at 3 to go potty.
Like she does every single night. Thank you very much.
And I was already awake. And then when Garrett came back in, I said, Garrett, I was near tears because my entire leg was aching so bad. The pain in my knee had spread all the way to my shin, my calf, the top of my foot. I had been sleeping with it elevated. I had taken ibuprofen. I was worried it was a blood clot because, similar things. So Garrett's like, I think we need to take you to the ER. So at 3:00 this morning, last night, we go to the ER, we get it checked. I get scans done and everything. Turns out I sprained a ligament in my inner knee and also there's a fissure in my meniscus. Do not ask me how it happened because it's embarrassing because we did figure out the cause of how it happened.
Tell them how it happened, babe. It starts with an S and ends with an X.
Sex?
Sex.
No, I did not I did not fissure my meniscus during sex.
You don't know that. It could have been possible.
No, what happened was the whole reason this pain started happening is I don't know if you watch on YouTube, but every single time I record, every single time I stream, every single time I color, every single time I ride Passenger Princess, I sit crisscross applesauce. Okay. I don't know what it is. There's something very comforting to me to have my legs up. Well, I've been doing it an abnormal amount. I'm talking every time I'm sitting, my legs are going into crisscross and they think over time, I literally sprained my ligament and fissured my meniscus by sitting crisscross applesauce for prolonged periods of time. So
yeah, basically Peyton hurt herself sitting crisscross applesauce.
So I can't even walk right now. And we were up at 3. And we're leaving tonight and it's a whole thing. But
taking a red eye tonight. So we're hanging in there. Yeah.
Yeah. That can
be the 10 seconds today. Thanks for supporting us. Thank you for being here. I hope you guys had a great holiday. Bonus episodes and ad-free content. As always, if you want it, feel free and check it out. I think we need to jump into today's episode because...
Wait, people are going to be really mad that I didn't say what my surprise was from you.
Oh, well, tell them you're going to post on socials maybe?
Okay, I'll just tell you what it is and then I'll post a picture on socials. Garrett custom made me a new wedding ring.
I did. I've been working on it for a few months with a company called Olive Ave.
They've done all our rings. They're amazing. We love them so much.
I really wanted to make Peyton a ring that was her, a new wedding ring. Really want to do something special. So I worked with them. They're amazing. They did a great job. We really figured out something that's Payton, so I'm excited for you guys to see it.
Yeah, go check my socials for that.
I actually, this isn't sponsored at all. We just love them, but I actually had reached out to a few different companies. They don't even know this, so maybe they're listening to this and they're like, what the? But I reached out to a few different companies, and after I talked to Olive Ave and a couple others, Olive Ave they were the choice to go with, and they absolutely killed it.
The reason you reached out is they don't typically do rings like the one Garrett made, but they were totally up for the challenge and they nailed it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the ring that I custom made Payton, I've never seen another company do a ring like that.
I haven't either.
I know that sounds so.
It's because it's just so.
You'll have to see it once you see it. It's very personal. Yeah. Anyways, I love it. I was really excited to do it for Payton, and she loves it, and it's been really fun.
Yes. So thank you, Garrett. I love the ring so much. It was the best gift I had ever been given. It totally caught me by surprise, and I love it. So thank you.
You're welcome, baby.
Our sources for this episode are cbsnews.com, newyorktimes.com, ksby.com, santamariatimes.com, latimes.com, people.com, foxnews.com, and npr.org. Okay, before we get into this episode, I did want to let you guys know that this case has been covered a lot. There's a lot of coverage on this case. In fact, there is a podcast called Your Own Backyard that covers this case extensively. But it's also a story that Garrett needs to hear and proves why the true crime genre can sometimes be extremely helpful.
I do want to say before we get into this, when we tend to cover high-profile cases like this, we will not have all the information. We're squeezing this into about a 45-minute podcast. There will be a lot left out. It won't be an insane detailed podcast, so we're going to do just the best summarized version possible. So know that ahead of time, so you don't get upset with us. That's just what this podcast is. And yeah.
If you're wanting every nitty-gritty detail, the deepest dive, go listen to Your Own Backyard. So every once in a while, a case comes along that reminds me why we do what we do. Because true crime shouldn't just be entertainment. It also serves a purpose. Whether that's spreading awareness to a cause, highlighting a community that doesn't get as much coverage, or just getting a missing person's face and name out there. We got into this business to offer support to the victims and their families. And to me, that is what comes first. And I know for a lot of you listeners, that comes first as well. And we keep doing what we do because honestly, you never know who will hear an episode and have the missing piece of the puzzle, which was exactly what happened to another podcaster named Chris Lambert when he covered a decades-old case about a young woman named Kristin Smart. Now, in 1996, Kristin went missing from her college campus in San Luis Obispo, California. But when there wasn't enough evidence against the primary suspect, the suspect that they knew from the very first day of the crime, the investigation slowed. That was until Chris Lambert decided to make a podcast on this case and give it a new life. He encouraged witnesses to come out of the woodwork, to speak up about their connection to the case, and ultimately, he helped get justice for Kristin Smart's family nearly 3 decades later.
That's so cool.
So in the mid-90s in California's San Joaquin Valley, just a little northwest of San Francisco, we have a teenage Kristin Smart who is thriving. She is crushing all of her high school classes, A's and B's across the board. She's a proficient athlete who loves swimming and skiing. She's also done a good amount of traveling for a kid her age in the 90s. We're talking about trips to London, Venezuela. She even spent one summer as a camp counselor in Hawaii. Kristin was super ambitious and always looking for her next adventure, which is why when it came time to choose a college, Kristin begged her parents to let her go to a school in the Virgin Islands. But both of Kristin's parents pushed back. They didn't think that that was a safe place to go to school. They said, hey, we would feel a lot better if you just go to college nearby, somewhere they could get to her with a quick car drive. The campus they preferred was one with a really low crime rate, Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo.
Okay.
So Kristin didn't love the idea, but if her parents were paying, how could she argue? At least she'd be out there on her own, starting a new chapter of her life. A day that finally came when she moved into the campus dorms in the fall of 1995. Now, like most college students, Kristin saw Cal Poly as a way to sort of reinvent herself. When she wasn't studying for her architecture degree, the 18-year-old Kristin was dyeing her hair from blonde to brunette or trying out new nicknames for herself like Roxy or Trixie. But Kristin also struggled to fit in a bit, probably because she stood out in a crowd. Kristin was tall for a girl. She was 6'1", to be exact. And while Kristin worked hard to navigate the social scene at Cal Poly, she also struggled with the difficulty of her classes. Kristin called her parents a lot that freshman year to say she had her doubts about whether Cal Poly was the right place for her. She was falling behind in some of her classes, which was unlike her, but she found them to be too challenging and she was getting a bit homesick. Now, I'm not saying this to say Kristin didn't have any friends. I think it's just that normal freshman year that a lot of us go through when you leave your hometown
For sure.
and go somewhere new.
Mm-hmm.
So by the spring of 1996, after her freshman year, 19-year-old Kristin was begging her parents to let her drop out altogether. And around April, Kristin's mother wrote her a long letter encouraging her to push through. It was almost summer break. She told her, hey, things are going to get better. She said, quote, world of opportunities are at your fingertips. That she should keep her focus on her classwork and learn from her mistakes. Essentially, just get back on the horse. So when Memorial Day weekend rolled around and a lot of the students left campus for the holiday, Kristin decided to stay back. She was going to stay in the dorms over holiday. She figured she could get some studying done for her finals. Actually, she called her mom that day around 5:30 p.m. to say she had some good news. She was able to make up a biology test from earlier in the semester. And luckily, she wasn't there that weekend alone. Her friend and neighbor from down the hall, Margarita Campos, stayed back too. And while school was definitely on the brain, Kristin also wanted to blow off some steam that weekend like any college student. So she encouraged her friend Margarita to go out with her that Friday night. So it's May 24th, 1996. And when they got to that first party on campus, Margarita was a bit disappointed, to say the least. Just a few guys were hanging out, playing video games on the couch, and she thought, I stopped studying for this. This is the party. So Kristin and Margarita left, but Kristin wasn't ready to head back to her room and call it a night. So she begged Margarita to walk with her down to Frat Row to see if, hey, let's just go see if any of the frats are throwing parties.
Okay.
But Margarita was over it. She told Kristin, no, I'm heading back. Kristin told her, you can't leave. She had forgotten her purse, her ID, and her keys. And if Margarita went back before she did, she wouldn't be able to get back into the building. So Margarita compromised. She gave Kristin her set of keys and headed back to the dorms while Kristin continued to search for a party solo. So Margarita said when she left Kristin, it was around 10:30 p.m. that night, and they were both stone cold sober. And if you're confused, like, well, now Margarita doesn't have keys, I'm assuming they thought that Margarita would be able to get someone to let her in at 10:30 rather than in the early morning hours when Kristin came home.
That makes sense.
So they're sober, but Kristin is still looking to have a good time. Eventually, she found herself at a keg party with about 60 or so other college students.
Okay.
And the 6-foot-tall Kristin was easily spotted amongst the crowd.
Oh, she's 6 feet tall?
6'1".
Dang.
But reports of what Kristin was doing there were sort of murky. Some said they saw Kristin that night flirting with a bunch of boys at the party, maybe even kissing one of the basketball players, maybe even pulling one into the bathroom. And others said they saw her chugging tequila. Others said, no, she didn't have a drink in her hand that night at all.
Isn't that so interesting?
Eyewitness
How you can
statements.
get so many different eyewitness statements. It sucks.
Yeah.
Because it makes everything very confusing.
But there was one thing that several party goers agreed on. And it was that at one point in the night, there was a loud crash in the hallway at this party. And when everyone gathered around, Kristin Smart was on the floor and a guy named Paul Flores was on top of her.
Okay.
So here's the deal with Paul Flores. He's pretty quiet, okay? He doesn't talk to too many people at the party. He mostly plays pool and hangs out by himself. But for a quiet guy like Paul, he sure does stir up a lot of gossip among his peers. For starters, Cal Poly was a bit out of Paul's depth. He never really had good grades or SAT scores in high school, but people said he got in because the university gave a little grace to applicants who were local to the area. So he wasn't doing well academically at Cal Poly, but honestly, the kid's grades were the least of his problems at college. The real issue was Paul had been doing some pretty creepy things to female students on campus and had gotten a pretty bad reputation because of it.
Okay.
One night, he drunkenly climbed a trellis up to one girl's balcony outside her apartment, and when she demanded him to leave, he refused, and then she called the police. Apparently, this wasn't an isolated incident. Paul was known to inappropriately hit on other female students. In fact, that was kind of sort of the only thing people on campus knew about Paul Flores. He literally would show up to all the parties and then just act creepy. He had no friends. The girls were just, he literally earned nicknames around campus as Chester the Molester and Scary Paul.
I don't get why there's people like that. And I don't know. Nothing. Keep going.
He's their age.
It's wild.
And people literally referred to him as Scary Paul. Paul's here.
Again, I have said this before. There's so many weird dudes out there. Some creepy dudes, man.
So basically, when the crash happens and people see Paul Flores on top of Kristin, they're like, dude, get off. Like, It's just another Paul thing. No one's really that surprised. Yeah. But other than that strange incident with Kristin, Paul seemed fairly subdued that night at the party, according to witnesses. Kristin, on the other hand, had drawn a little more attention. I guess at around 2 a.m. that night, a senior student named Tim Davis, who was helping throw the party, was clearing people out. And that's when he spotted Kristin, who had actually introduced herself as Roxy that night. And she was passed out on their neighbor's lawn. So he's like getting everyone out. It's 2 a.m., time to go. And then he notices Kristin, aka Roxy, passed out. Now here's what alarming. If Kristin wasn't drinking like a lot of the partygoers reported, then how is she passed out?
True.
The only thing people can think is she had been slipped something.
Oh, okay.
Because when Tim woke her up, he could tell that she was really out of it. Mm-hmm. Tim asked her where she lived, and Kristin told him which dormitory. And since it was only a 10-minute walk from the party, Tim was like, okay, let me just walk you to your dorms. And that's when another girl who was also leaving the party, Cheryl Anderson, asked if she could walk with them. She's like, hey, I'm alone as well. Can I walk with you guys? She was headed to the dormitory right across from Kristin's. So the three of them started strolling when, out of nowhere, another guy came up and said, hey, I'm also going that way. Let me take over. You just go back in the house. Who do you think this is?
Paul
Flores. Now, Tim, a senior, knew Paul was weird, but clearly didn't know a lot about Paul's reputation because he thinks nothing of letting Paul escort these two girls back. Now, during this walk back, Cheryl realizes that Kristin is a lot more out of it than she is. So when Kristin keeps needing to stop and Paul sort of supports her, she finds it strange that during this, like as Kristin's taking more time, Paul says, Cheryl, just go on without us. I can walk her home. You just go ahead. And eventually Cheryl gets to the door of her building and she says goodnight to Kristin and Paul. And at this point, she can see that Kristin is only 40 yards away from the front door of her building. So she's thinking, okay, I got her home safe. Like she's only 40 yards away from her entry. And she says to Paul, will you make sure she gets up to her room? And he's like, yeah, I will. But then Paul does something really strange, totally on brand for him. Okay. He's supporting this very out of it Kristin. And he says, hey, Cheryl, do you want to give me a kiss before you go to your dorm?
What?
And she's like,
no,
Paul. And he's like, okay, how about just a hug? And she's like, no. And then she watches as Paul walks back over to Kristin and leads her toward her dormitory. Now, the following morning is Saturday, May 25th. And Margarita is wondering why Kristin, her friend, hasn't returned her set of keys to her, the ones that she gave her the night before. So she heads down the hall to Kristin's room and she knocks, only there's no answer. And it's not until Kristin's roommate comes back later that Margarita learns, through the grapevine, that Kristin's side of the room is untouched. It doesn't look like she ever made it back to her bed that night. Her purse, her ID, her keys, all the things she left there are still in the same spot.
But, okay, let me make sure I'm getting this right. But that other girl saw them going back
to the door, towards the door.
Okay, towards where she, like her door.
Yes,
to her
Kristin's
building.
room.
Okay,
yes.
Got it.
So they figure, okay, maybe Kristin just met someone at the party. Maybe she's out having a day with someone. Heck, maybe she decided to go home for the weekend, right? Like maybe she'll be back. But when 48 hours pass and there's still no sign of Kristin, her friends decide to call campus police. But it's not until Monday, May 27th, that the campus police then call Kristin's family asking if she went home to see them for the holiday.
Okay.
Now, at this point, when the police call and it's been this long since her daughter is seen, Kristin's mom is worried. It wasn't like Kristin to go a few days without calling them, but it also wasn't unheard of. When she gets this phone call, she is like, this is alarming. And so right after this call, Kristin's parents go to the local police to file a missing person report because by this point, Kristin has been missing for nearly 72 hours. Yet, the police tell her family, it's still too early to file a report, which, as I will say for the 800th time, is not true. There's no waiting period on a missing person report in this country.
Okay.
But they also say, hey, this is Cal Poly's police's jurisdiction anyways, so you would need to file there if you're going to, and they're probably already on it. However, it is not until Tuesday that Cal Poly actually starts taking this investigation seriously, partly because of the holiday. They're thinking, well, she probably just went somewhere. But this is also problematic because a lot can be done in 4 days to cover up a crime.
Mm-hmm.
Now, look, I get that these campus police departments probably don't deal with cases like this very often. It's sort of uncharted territory for them, but it's completely understandable for the Smart family to be frustrated with how this whole thing has been handled. In fact, they say that they treated Kristin's case as if it were like another stolen bicycle on campus. Plus, listen to what the campus police wrote in their initial report about Kristin's disappearance. Quote, Smart does not have any close friends at Cal Poly. Smart appeared to be under the influence of alcohol on Friday night. Smart was talking with and socializing with several different males at the party. Smart lives her life in her own way, not conforming to typical teenage behavior. Of course, they finish with, these observations are in no way implying that her behavior caused her disappearance, but they provide a picture of her conduct on the night of her disappearance. They're victim blaming.
I think the crazy, she doesn't live a typical teenage life. Like, she's doing what every other teenager's doing.
Every other student. They're basically slut shaming her.
Yeah, that's wild.
They're saying, hey, we're not victim blaming, but they're victim blaming. She was
seen with a bunch of guys and she was drinking, so sorry.
So she's probably just somewhere.
We can't do much about that.
And even worse, police do not call Paul Flores in for an interview until 6 days after Kristin goes missing.
Okay.
Despite the fact that in the initial investigation, when they figure out that she went to this party and they talk to people, everyone says, oh, she walked home with Paul Flores. He was the last person to see her before she disappeared.
So he had 6 days to do
whatever he
wanted.
Even though police knew that he was the last person she was seen with. And get this, when they do talk to him, they don't check his dorm room either. That won't happen for another 10 days.
It doesn't matter at that point.
Which, when I tell you how his first interview went with police, you are going to be like, why did it take them another 4 days to go search this kid's room? Okay. So the police make Paul walk through every step of what he did that night. You know, they've gone through the grapevine, realized, okay, she was last seen with Paul. They wait this alarming amount of days and pull him in. And they interview him a few more times that week. And his story never stays consistent from the very first time. But he does manage to maintain that the last time he saw Kristin was after she said goodnight and walked towards her dorm alone that evening. And here's what's even more problematic than the story changes. Paul shows up to that first interview that's days after she went missing, with scratches all over his hands and a very obvious black eye.
Holy crap.
And he tells the police, I don't actually know how I got this black eye and these scratches. I just woke up with it. That's what he tells police initially. Okay. And so police pull him in the next day and they're like, hey, how did you get this black eye really? And the next day he says, actually I got it playing basketball over the weekend. And then when they pull him in the third interview, before they've even checked his dorm, he says, actually, no, it wasn't from basketball. You're right. I got it hitting my head working on my truck the other day.
Wild. I'm already, I used to get I still get frustrated about this, but doing these cases, I just assume that someone along the way, not always, Kim, not always, but someone in cases like these, someone drops the ball. I'm just like, all right, well, here we go again. Yeah.
I mean, I told you from the very get-go, there was one suspect this entire investigation, and it's very obvious.
And it's crazy because I know we're going to get to it, but I know that entire podcast, I've never listened to it, is going to be the reason that Paul gets caught, and it was him the whole time. And
police knew it too.
Police knew it, and he was right in front of their faces, and yeah, it's just crazy. And
when you hear the history of Paul, that he was called Scary Paul, Chester the Molester, it's just, I mean, his history is egregious. It is insane. So they decide to talk to Paul's roommate, and they learned something else. The two of them had been joking about Kristin's disappearance after it happened.
Wow.
And the roommate asked Paul kiddingly, what did you do with her, since you were the last person to see her? Like joking, like you were the last person to see her and now she's missing. And Paul said, she's home with my parents, as a joke. So this is oddly strange and specific. Something that definitely stood out enough to Paul's roommate for him to tell the police. But like I said, the police didn't do much about Paul in the way of evidence until 10 days after that first interview. That's when they finally took a team of search dogs through the dorms at Cal Poly. There are 0 hits as they are walking these dogs through the dorm, through Kristin's dorm, until they reach Paul's bedroom. In fact, the dogs go straight to Paul Flores's bed.
Hit, basically.
They get a hit. Okay. So at this point, Paul refuses to take a polygraph, but he did have another 90-minute interview with police where he acted incredibly weird. He was tucking himself up into a little ball on the chair. He was pulling his arms into his shirt. And then he looked the cops dead in the eyes and said, if you're so smart, then you tell me where the body is. Okay, at this point, no one even is saying Kristin's dead. She's been missing.
You're telling me he said all of this and he was never arrested?
Nope. So after that interview, Paul's parents hire him a lawyer, which was definitely necessary because they have their prime suspect. Keep in mind, for the first month of the investigation, Cal Poly police are also tracking this case solo. It wasn't until after the first month that they finally handed the case over to the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Department. And they come in and are like, hey, Paul's our guy. Primarily after hearing about the joke he made to his roommate, the one where he said Kristin was at home with his parents.
Yeah.
But it still took them about 2 months to finally get to the Flores' home 17 miles away. And they don't bring cadaver dogs with them. They don't bring a forensic team or even search Paul or his dad Ruben's car, which is a huge mistake considering right after this, one of their trucks was traded in and the other was reported stolen.
Holy crap.
So it's right after the family's house is searched. Paul Flores' family's house is searched. One of their trucks gets traded in and the other gets stolen.
So embarrassing. That's embarrassing.
So because they didn't really come with much reinforcements, the sheriff's department doesn't find any notable evidence at the Flores' residence that first search. Still, they keep interviewing people, and about 5 months after Kristin's disappearance, around the fall of 1996, Paul was actually brought in front of a grand jury. So they're deciding to try to indict him.
Yep.
While the proceedings were sort of kept under lock and key, I do know that there weren't any charges filed against Paul Flores at that time. So they basically flirt with the idea and decide not to do it.
Okay.
Even though police know they have their guy. So for the next 6 or 7 months, they keep interviewing witnesses. It's still not moving the needle, which is why in May of 1997, the sheriff made a statement to the press. one that will actually become a pretty big screw up in this case. He says they have interviewed almost 100 people. This is what he's saying to the public. And everything leads to Paul Flores. So they out him. But, and I quote, "We need Paul Flores to tell us what happened to Kristin Smart." So absent something from Mr. Flores confessing, I don't see us completing this case.
He said this publicly.
Which is basically handing Paul Flores a pass on a silver platter. As long as he keeps his mouth shut, he will get away with this crime. That is what the police basically just said.
Field day with that.
And Paul hears them loud and clear. So when the Smarts sue Paul Flores in a wrongful death civil lawsuit, because at this point everyone knows he did it, he already has his strategy. Say nothing, plead the fifth. And when he's deposed by the Smarts lawyer 6 months later for that civil suit, he invokes his Fifth Amendment 27 times.
Holy crap.
He's like, nope, I'm not talking. But it turns out telling Paul Flores to keep his mouth shut wasn't the only ball dropped by police. Apparently, there was a giant piece of evidence that they'd received about 3 months after Kristin disappeared, and it was one that fell completely through the cracks. So this requires a little backstory, but when Kristin disappeared in May of 1996, Paul's parents, Susan and Ruben, were separated and living apart. And Susan and Ruben become a big part of this case. I'm just going to spoil it for you because a lot of people believe that both of them were involved in helping cover up. Okay. They believe that Paul did something to Kristin and then called his parents, and his parents helped him get away with the crime. So Susan and Ruben, his mother and father, are separated and living apart. But 4 months later, they thought, maybe we should give it another shot. Susan put her house up for rent and moved back in with Ruben for a bit. And that's when Susan decides to rent their home out to a young couple. And they move in that fall. Okay, this is the home that Paul Flores would have come back to. So she's now renting this home out to a young couple after Kristin's disappeared. But one day, while the mother of this young couple is washing her car in the driveway, she sees something on the ground that catches her eye. And it's an earring. It's not just a simple diamond on a post.
No way Kristin's earring is just sitting there.
It's a very specific earring. One that matches a necklace Kristin Smart was wearing on her missing persons posters.
That is so that's okay.
This house has still not been searched with cadaver dogs, even though Paul basically told his roommate that she was at his parents' house. Okay?
Yeah.
So because this young couple knows about the connection between Susan and Ruben and the Kristin Smart disappearance, they decide to turn the earring over to the sheriff's department. Except for God knows what reason, it was never marked and filed as evidence. So this woman who's living in this house says, hey, I found this earring. I'm pretty sure it's hers because look at the missing person poster. And they never file it as evidence. And here's the frustrating thing. I know you're thinking that this house that the couple moved into was the house that police had searched.
No, they never searched it.
It wasn't. This was Susan's house, and the police only searched Ruben's house. So this house had never even been searched, but the earring was found in the driveway, which essentially means there were 2 places for Paul to hide evidence, but only one was searched. He said it was at my parents' house, but they were separated. They only searched Ruben's and left Susan's unsearched. In fact, Susan's house wasn't searched until long after that earring was turned in March of 1997. This was 10 months after Kristin's disappearance. But the police didn't find anything of note. And it would take 3 more years before they returned to search her property.
Oh, at that point, why even search it?
Now, over that time, Susan and Ruben did call it off, and Susan was back living in the home where the earring was found. And on June 19th, 2000, there was a knock on Susan's door, and this time it was the FBI's evidence response team with a search warrant. Actually, the warrant even gave them permission to dig up the backyard, only they didn't follow through with it for whatever reason. They don't dig it up. In 2007, they show up again. 2007, she went missing in 1996. They show up to this house again with ground penetrating radar, only they don't find anything of note then either.
Oh, guys, it's 11 years later.
So you can imagine how frustrating this entire process must be for the Smart family.
Yeah.
To feel like this entire family has something to do with their daughter's disappearance, probable murder, and they're so close, yet so far from finding any real sign of their daughter because this entire family has pled the fifth. And despite the mistakes they made along the way, it seems like the sheriff's department really was committed to the case as well, especially to keep it open for more than a decade while continuing to pursue leads and searches. But on the other hand, this means Paul Flores is just out there living his life. Okay, so he leaves college, he moves to Southern California, Irvine to be exact.
Wow.
He gets a job in Irvine.
What?
I'm going to mention that Garrett probably went to the restaurant Paul Flores was working at in Irvine at the time he was working.
No.
I am telling you.
What year?
Yeah, the early 2000s, 2007. You were not gone. You were living in Irvine.
No, 100%. I was like basically in middle school, high school.
And I should have looked it up. It's like a common chain, like a Chili's or an Outback Steakhouse. It's like a really common.
That's insane. You're telling
restaurant.
me I've seen this guy.
I promise you probably ate at this restaurant while he was working there.
That's wild.
And might I add, this entire time that he is out at this restaurant, he is hitting on girls, roofing girls. Like, he's still being Scary Paul after Kristin Smart, after he is the main, outed suspect in Kristin Smart's disappearance. Okay. He's a free man and maybe the only person in the world who knows what happened to Kristin Smart that night. However, there was one person who couldn't stand the thought of that. And it wasn't someone related to Kristin. It was actually a complete stranger, a journalist, podcaster named Chris Lambert. So this is where we enter Chris Lambert into this story, okay? Chris grew up in the San Luis Obispo area. In fact, he was about 8 years old when Kristin disappeared from college. And he remembered driving by a billboard of her missing poster every day on his way to school growing up. And then one day, when Chris reached adulthood and became a CBS News consultant, he had a thought. I wonder whatever happened to that girl on that billboard that I drove by from my hometown. Mm-hmm. Whatever happened to that girl? Why hadn't her case been solved? That billboard was still up. So Chris's intention was to get some answers. He wanted to reignite conversations around her case. This was a hometown case for him. So Chris started interviewing people about Kristin and Paul. And from that, he launched his own podcast called Your Own Backyard in September of 2019. By then, it had been 23 years since Kristin went missing.
Also, I want to point out that 2019 is before Payton and I even started
the show.
So that's just impressive of itself because that's still so early.
So basically, what Chris did is he's like, I'm going to look into this case. He didn't even really know that much about it. He looks into it and he's like, wait, you're telling me we probably know where her body was at one point. We know who did it. We know who she was last seen with. And this is unsolved and Paul Flores is free.
Yeah.
So he decides to make a podcast. He's like, if I can spread the word, maybe the police will do something. And I'm gonna be honest. The podcast was very successful. A lot of people started coming out of the woodwork to say, hey, we listened to your podcast. It was released episode by episode, and I have information about Paul Flores. And they wanted to share it with Chris. So this is when a lot more victims of Paul Flores, not murder victims, but sexual assault victims, roofie victims, creepy dates, creepy work stories. This is when all of these women start coming forward. For example, in February 2020, about 6 months after the podcast was released, and honestly, a couple months later, Garrett and I were going to start Murder with My Husband, Chris got a really fascinating tip. Apparently, just a few nights after police conducted their last search on Ruben Flores' house, a neighbor noticed something strange. Ruben and his ex-wife, Susan, along with her new partner, all stayed up throughout the night after police had just searched it, doing something underneath Ruben's deck. So the police search their house, they leave, and then a neighbor notices all three of these adults doing something underneath Ruben's deck.
I cannot believe that the parents are involved. What? Allegedly, I'm going to assume. Mm-hmm. What evil human beings? That's
There were also a lot of accounts that came from women, like I said, who had encounters with the now 42-year-old Paul Flores. Apparently, there were a number of women who Paul had made inappropriate passes at, who he had tried to kiss, who he tried to force himself upon. An ex-girlfriend of his even said he was physically and verbally abusive throughout their relationship. Now, Chris also made sure to share these tips with the police. Okay, he wasn't just making the podcast. He was taking everything he was learning to the police. I mean, his goal was to find out what happened to Kristin once and for all to make sure the right person ended up behind bars. Eventually, the noise surrounding Paul Flores in this case, because of the Your Own Backyard podcast,
got so big,
was so loud that police could not ignore it. So in April of 2020, because of the podcast, solely because of this podcast gaining steam, police decide to raid Paul's home in San Pedro, California. And what they found pretty much put the nail in Paul's coffin. It was a trove of videos and photos on Paul Flores' computer. Okay, he's now 40 years old. He's living in his own house, showing him engaging in sexual acts with at least 10 different unconscious women. He had roofied women and then videoed himself sexually assaulting them, and all of this was found on his computer. But police don't move in to arrest Paul just yet. They were still going for the big ticket, which means they were trying to find evidence that he had murdered Kristin Smart. So in March of the following year, they returned to Ruben Flores' house, because at this point, they're pretty sure the parents are connected. The one where he and Susan were seen doing something under the deck by the neighbors. And this time, they find something notable. After digging under that deck, because the podcast tells them to go do this, police collect soil samples. When they send them out for analysis, they discover that the soil underneath this deck contained fibers and biological evidence, meaning there was human blood and DNA underneath this deck. They also find a 4-foot deep hole under that deck that is just empty, but it's 4 feet deep.
That's so sad,
And they find some suspicious stains inside a trailer parked on the property, but they don't find a body. And you have to understand that this was happening live as he's reporting on this podcast. Okay, he drops an episode and then the police go and dig it up, and then he drops another episode and he's like, there's a 4-foot hole under there. Okay. And unfortunately, that biological evidence was so old that it couldn't be concretely tied to Kristin Smart, but it was enough for them to get an arrest warrant. So in April of 2021, police not only arrest now 44-year-old Paul Flores for murder, they also arrest his 80-year-old father, Ruben, for being an accessory after the fact. Because if they believe this body was on Ruben's property, then that means he was involved.
80 years old. Could you imagine being arrested at 80 years old for something you did
when your son was in college?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad he was.
So when the trial began in July of 2022, Paul and Ruben, who both pleaded not guilty, were tried together for Kristin's disappearance and murder.
Okay.
And Chris, our podcaster, is sitting in on the trial and then making updates on the podcast. Okay. They have 2 separate juries, one for each of them. And while a lot of witnesses were called to the stand, there was one that blew this entire case out of the water. It was a woman named Jennifer Hudson who had hung out with Paul often shortly after Kristin's disappearance. And her story, her testimony changed everything. Jennifer said that during the summer of 1996, she and a few friends were at a skate park with Paul when a message came on over the radio about Kristin's disappearance. And that's when Paul turned to Jennifer and said, hey, I was at a party with that girl last night. So he's hanging out with this girl at a skate park. Something comes over the radio about Kristin's disappearance, and he just tells him, hey, I was at a party with that girl that night. And he said, I actually was there and I did it. And I put Kristin under a skate ramp at my parents' house. So through tears, Jennifer tells the jury how he had basically confessed to this murder and she had held on to this information because she was scared of Paul, but it had eaten her away for years. Okay. But when her friend told her about Chris Lambert's podcast, she thought, okay, I'm just going to finally do it. I'm going to come forward to Chris and share what Paul had told me. And as far as we know, this was the only confession he ever made to anyone regarding Kristin's murder. Between Jennifer's testimony and the stories from the other women Paul had sexually assaulted, he didn't really stand a chance. On October 18th, 2022, Paul was found guilty of first-degree murder. So literally, he is found guilty of her murder at trial. However, his father, Ruben Flores, was acquitted for his charges of accessory. So the two juries don't necessarily line up. The one says, yes, Paul did it. The other says, no, the father was not involved. And Susan Flores and her boyfriend were never charged either. But in March of 2023, Paul was sentenced to 25 years to life for killing Kristin Smart, which was a pretty big win for the justice system, considering to this day, Kristin's body has never been found. It was a no-body case.
That's sad. I mean, it's probably gone, which is horrible, but I mean, he's found guilty.
Yeah. But Paul, who maintained his innocence throughout, has still never confessed openly to what happened that night. He's never told Kristin's family what happened. Oh my gosh,
we need to bring
which
back...
is actually insane.
Truth serum.
And because of that, a lot of questions remain. Did Paul mean to kill Kristin?
Yeah.
Was there a struggle that night that led Kristin to give him that black eye? Did he roofie her too much and make her overdose? Where was Kristin's final resting place? We believe that at one point it was in Ruben's backyard.
That's so crazy.
But now, obviously, because of the heat and the police threatening to come back and search, they had moved her. Allegedly. And if it weren't for Chris Lambert and the renewed interest that he sparked in the case, and honestly, a lot of the evidence and testimony that he uncovered,
this would never have been solved.
I don't think police ever would have done anything. And to be honest, he was referred to as the podcaster at trial, and he was brought up by the defense, by Paul Flores' defense, multiple times. So at this trial, it's the podcaster, because he becomes like an integral part of the resurgence of this case and the evidence that's brought up.
Props. That's amazing.
But like I said earlier, it's cases like these that remind me why podcasts, true crime podcasts, are valuable. Why these stories need coverage, especially unsolved ones. And it was nice to hear this sentiment from Kristin's mother, Denise Smart, too. She said that while there certainly is a lot of evil in this world, there are a lot more good people out there willing to come together and help out in a time of need. Her family has basically said, without Chris and this podcast, we would have never got justice.
No, 100%. I mean, and we see this, I hate bringing it up, but Gabby Petito's a good one because everyone was going crazy, and then the YouTubers came out with the footage.
Yeah.
I mean, it does happen and does work. Obviously, it can get sometimes out of hand, and I understand there can be... there's a lot of sensitivity around it, but
unethical coverage, if you will.
Unethical coverage, but it is crazy to see the good that comes out of it as well.
It's not just the podcasters, though; it's the viewers. Because
100%.
I mean, Chris, his podcast was just a train for listeners who had contact with Paul Flores to be like, wait, I need to come forward and say my interaction with him. Word of mouth. And that is the very summarized story of Kristin Smart. Again, if you want a deep dive and a very well done podcast, I would suggest listening to Your Own Backyard. All right, you guys, that was our case for this week, and we will see you next time with another one in 2025, I believe. I love it.
And I hate it.
Goodbye.